There is a certain kind of exhaustion that almost nobody has a clear name for. You are not ill, you are not lazy, you have not failed at anything obvious or measurable. Nothing dramatic or catastrophic has taken place. And yet, one morning you wake up and feel completely drained, as if something inside you has quietly shut down. You feel finished with people, finished with the constant noise, finished with showing up again and again, giving everything you can, and still feeling like it somehow never measures up. You grow tired of trying to explain yourself to a world that never quite seems to understand where you are coming from. You are exhausted by everything, and the most difficult part is that you cannot fully explain why. If this feeling sounds familiar, you are not alone. More importantly, there is nothing inherently wrong with you. Carl Jung, one of the most influential figures in modern psychology, spent years working with individuals who felt exactly this way. Patient after patient came to him carrying the same unnamed fatigue, overwhelmed, isolated, emotionally drained in ways they could not clearly describe, convinced that something inside them was fundamentally flawed. What Jung discovered about these individuals did not just influence psychology, it reshaped how we understand human consciousness itself. He found that the exhaustion they carried was not a sign of weakness. It was not proof of mental illness. It was not an indication that they were too fragile for reality. Instead, it was the predictable outcome of a very specific psychological strength being used in the wrong direction for far too long. Once you begin to understand what that strength truly is and what it was meant for, the exhaustion starts to make a different kind of sense. It no longer feels like a dead end, but more like a turning point. This type of exhaustion is rarely discussed openly. It is not the kind that comes from working too many hours or missing sleep. It runs deeper than physical tiredness. It settles into the body and wraps itself around the inner self. The people who feel it most intensely are often the ones who care deeply, give generously, and carry their pain quietly. If you have ever felt completely drained after a conversation that others seem to handle effortlessly, you already understand this. If you have ever walked into a room and immediately sensed that something was off, even though everyone else appeared perfectly fine, you know this feeling. And if you have ever been told that you are too sensitive, too emotional, or too intense simply because you notice things others overlook or ignore, then this perspective may change how you see yourself. Jung observed that those who struggle the most are not struggling because they are broken. They are struggling because they are wired differently. And that difference, when understood and developed properly, is not a flaw. It is one of the most powerful psychological abilities a person can have. Jung believed that much of human life is influenced not by conscious thought, but by hidden psychological forces that operate beneath awareness. He referred to this domain as the unconscious and dedicated his career to exploring it. He discovered that the unconscious is not only personal, but also collective. Every group, families, communities, entire societies, shares an invisible emotional atmosphere. It consists of unspoken agreements, buried emotions, denied truths, and suppressed fears. These elements are rarely discussed openly, yet they can be felt by those who are attuned to them. Most people do not consciously notice this deeper layer. They interact with life at the surface level, the words people say, the emotions people choose to display, the narratives people present. For them, this works well enough, but there is a smaller group of individuals for whom the surface layer is almost impossible to focus on, because they are constantly aware of what lies beneath it. They notice tension hidden behind cheerful words. They sense sadness beneath humor. They detect unease in environments that appear calm. They perceive fear behind confidence, loneliness behind laughter, and anger beneath silence. This is not something they choose, it is simply how they experience reality. Jung referred to this as differentiated intuitive perception, particularly in those he described as the introverted intuitive type. These individuals naturally perceive unconscious material, emotional and psychological signals that others may never notice. He estimated that this specific profile might represent around 1% of the population. However, the broader concept of highly sensitive individuals, later studied extensively by Elaine Aron, suggests that up to 20% of people experience the world in a more intense and emotionally layered way. This means that a significant portion of people move through life experiencing a richer, more complex version of reality. Yet many of them have been taught to see this as a problem. When these individuals came to Jung, they did not feel gifted. They felt exhausted, confused, and often apologetic for who they were. And it is not surprising, considering they had spent years being told that their way of experiencing life was wrong. Imagine growing up with this level of perception. As a child, you sense things that others do not acknowledge. You feel tension between your parents, even when they insist everything is fine. You notice emotional undercurrents at the dinner table that no one speaks about. You recognize when a friend is struggling at home, even if they never say a word. When you try to express what you see, you are often dismissed. You are told that you are imagining things, being too sensitive, or overreacting. You are encouraged to stop complicating matters and accept things as they appear. Over time, you adapt. You stop voicing your observations. You begin to suppress what you feel. You learn to doubt your own perceptions. You prioritize the comfort of others over your own clarity. Eventually, you develop a deeply exhausting habit, the constant monitoring and filtering of your inner experience to avoid making others uncomfortable. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly. He described individuals who had been conditioned to distrust their most reliable ability, their perception. Over time, this does not just silence them, it disconnects them from themselves. Another pattern Jung identified is equally important. Highly sensitive individuals do not just feel more deeply, they also care more deeply. This combination makes them particularly vulnerable in relationships. They often become emotional stabilizers for others. In their families, they sense stress and adjust themselves to maintain peace. In friendships, they are the ones who listen, support, and show up consistently. In romantic relationships, they often understand their partners on a deeper level than they are understood in return. In workplaces, they can read dynamics effortlessly, navigating personalities and tensions while receiving little recognition for it. This pattern has a certain logic. If you can feel what others feel and anticipate their needs, it seems natural to use that ability to help. It feels responsible. It feels right. But Jung identified a critical problem. When your perception is constantly directed outward, focused on others, you begin to neglect your own inner world. You stop recognizing your own needs. You lose track of when situations are harmful to you. You become skilled at managing others while becoming disconnected from yourself. Because your empathy is genuine, you are also more susceptible to being drained by others, sometimes unintentionally, sometimes not. Jung described this as a dangerous psychological position, using your greatest strength in a way that gradually harms you. Your gift turns into your burden. Yet, beneath all of this, something remarkable is happening. Even as these individuals suppress their perceptions and prioritize others, they are also observing with extraordinary depth. They pay attention in ways that are precise and detailed. They notice inconsistencies between words and actions. They track emotional patterns over time. They remember subtle shifts in behavior and tone. They gather insights that others overlook entirely. This deep awareness, though often hidden and unacknowledged, holds the potential for transformation, if it is finally turned inward and trusted once again. Here's your rewritten version with slight wording changes, proper formatting, and all requested adjustments. They accumulated a vast amount of accurate insight about the people in their lives. And then, because they had been conditioned to doubt their own perceptions, they stored all of that information away and chose to do nothing with it. Jung found this pattern deeply meaningful because it revealed something important. These individuals were not naive, they were not blind, they were not in denial in the usual sense of the word. They were something far more complex. They had access to highly accurate information, and yet they were actively choosing not to act on it because they had been taught to believe that their perceptions were less reliable than the explanations and reassurances given by others. He documented case after case in which a patient had, for years, noticed clear signs of deception or dysfunction within a close relationship, and had consistently explained those signs away. Not because they failed to see them, but because acknowledging them fully would have required trusting themselves. And trusting themselves was something they had been trained not to do. Jung recognized this as a kind of slow-moving psychological tragedy. All of that perceptual accuracy, all of that emotional intelligence, all of that deeply earned understanding of human behavior was being actively suppressed in order to maintain relationships with people who were not always worth maintaining. Then something would occur, something Jung recorded repeatedly across many cases. A betrayal. Not a minor one, not something vague that could be brushed aside or forgiven in a single conversation. A large, unmistakable, undeniable betrayal. The kind that makes it impossible to keep choosing comforting explanations over clear evidence. The kind that forces a moment of truth. Maybe it was discovering that a partner had been dishonest for years. Maybe it was realizing that a family member had been manipulating a situation the empath had been trying desperately to hold together. Maybe it was a sudden, piercing moment of cruelty from someone they had protected, defended, and given everything to. Whatever form it took, the result was always the same. It broke something open. Now, Jung observed that most people who witnessed empaths reaching this breaking point expected a certain kind of reaction. They expected tears. They expected emotional collapse. They expected a dramatic, chaotic response, often associated with someone who feels deeply. But that is not what happened. What happened instead was something Jung described as one of the most striking transformations he had ever seen in his clinical work. The person became calm. Not the shallow calm of numbness or shock, but a deep, grounded, almost unsettling calm. Like the surface of a lake after a violent storm has passed and the water has finally become still. Jung wrote about this calm with a sense of quiet respect in his private notes. He described it as the calm of someone who had finally, after years of inner conflict, stopped resisting their own perception. The calm of someone who looked at the evidence before them and for the first time chose to believe it. Because what a betrayal of that magnitude does to a highly perceptive person is not destroy their trust in themselves. It confirms it. It takes every observation they made, every pattern they noticed, every inconsistency they quietly recorded, every internal warning they suppressed, and validates it. They were right all along. They knew. And now they know that they knew. In that moment, something fundamental shifts. The belief that kept them stuck, the idea that their perceptions could not be trusted, that their instincts were too intense, that others understood reality better than they did, breaks apart. And what emerges from beneath that belief is something powerful. Jung referred to this moment as shadow integration under extreme pressure. To understand this, it helps to explore one of the central ideas in Jungian psychology, the shadow. In Jung's model of the psyche, the shadow is the part of ourselves that we have rejected, suppressed, or refused to acknowledge. It includes everything we have been taught is unacceptable about who we are. Everything we learn to hide in order to feel loved, accepted, or included. For most people, the shadow contains things like anger, selfishness, ambition, jealousy, or the desire for control. Qualities society often teaches us to bury. But for highly empathic individuals, the shadow often holds something different. It holds their own strength. Think about that carefully. Because of how sensitive individuals are often raised and shaped, the qualities they learn to suppress are not primarily destructive impulses. Instead, they suppress their clarity, their boundaries, their anger, and their authority over their own experience. They are taught that being certain is arrogance, that expressing anger is dangerous, that setting boundaries is selfish, that trusting their own perception over someone else's explanation is immature. So all of that gets pushed into the shadow. Not cruelty, not malice, not domination, but the basic, healthy, and completely valid conviction that they have the right to trust what they perceive, feel what they feel, and protect themselves accordingly. Shadow integration is the process of reclaiming all of this. And when it happens, Jung observed, it does not make people darker or colder. It makes them whole. It restores access to the full range of who they are, their care and their clarity together, their empathy and their boundaries together, their sensitivity and their strength together. The individuals Jung studied did not become less kind after this integration. They became more precise in their kindness. They did not stop caring about others. They began caring about themselves with equal seriousness. Jung described watching these individuals go through a remarkable transformation in the months following what he called the clarity event. They stopped over-explaining themselves, not because they became dismissive, but because they no longer felt obligated to justify accurate perceptions. They stopped apologizing for what they observed. Instead, they began expressing it calmly, clearly, and without hesitation. They stopped tolerating situations that required them to pretend they did not see what was obvious. Not through confrontation or drama, but simply by removing themselves. And perhaps most striking of all, Jung noted that they stopped feeling intimidated by the people who once made them feel small. This was one of the most remarkable changes he documented. The individuals who had previously taken advantage of them, the manipulative ones, the emotionally dishonest ones, those who relied on the empath's self-doubt, began to feel uneasy around them. They could not always explain why. Because the integrated individual was not aggressive or hostile. They were simply steady, present, clear-minded, and impossible to destabilize or manipulate. And that, Jung observed, is deeply unsettling for someone whose influence depends on confusion or distortion. He described this shift as what happens when a mirror becomes impossible to avoid. For years, the highly perceptive individual had reflected back what others wanted to see. Now, they reflected what was actually there. And those who had carefully controlled their image found that unbearable. At this point, it is important to address something that often comes up when hearing this kind of perspective. There is a natural temptation to divide people into clear categories, the innocent empaths and the manipulative others, the victims and the offenders. Jung was deeply skeptical of this kind of thinking, not because harmful dynamics do not exist, they absolutely do, but because true growth requires something more difficult than simply identifying who caused harm. It requires looking honestly at one's own participation, not as self-blame and not to excuse harmful behavior, but to understand the full dynamic. There is a meaningful difference between being a passive victim and being someone who unconsciously participated in a harmful pattern. Highly perceptive individuals often sense problems long before they fully unfold. They notice the warning signs. They feel the misalignment between what someone presents and what they actually are. And yet, they override those signals, sometimes because they want to believe the best, sometimes because they fear conflict, sometimes because their need for connection outweighs their instinct for protection. Jung described this as failing to honor the superior function, their strongest ability, their perception, and actively working against it for short-term comfort. Shadow integration requires confronting this pattern honestly. It means asking not only who caused harm, but also when you first recognized it and why you chose not to act. That question is not easy, but it is essential. Because until it is answered truthfully, the pattern tends to repeat. New situations, new relationships, the same underlying dynamic.